session, as you've probably just noted. I hope that's okay for everyone. Um, what we're going to do in terms of the format, we're going to hear a brief up to 10-minute presentations from each of our authors this evening. And then we're going to have a fair time after the presentations to hopefully have a good, lively discussion about the issues and topics that have been raised by the speakers and any other related topics that are on people's minds. I'm going to encourage you to use the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen to post questions when you have them. And I will do my best to field them when we get to the discussion session. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Tom Bolton, who, as I'm sure some of you will know, has written two volumes on the topic of London's lost rivers, Walker's Guides to London's Lost Rivers. The first one published over 10 years ago now, which is amazing to recall, and the volume 2 published more recently. And as you probably know, if you've dipped into these books, they're full of tantalising details and information and snippets of history about London's lost riverscapes. So I'm delighted to hand over to Tom Bolton, who's going to kick off this evening's session. Over to you, Tom.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Neil. Thank you for inviting me. I'm just going to share my screen. So it's really nice to be part of this event, thinking about rivers in lots of different ways. They are essentially London's countryside in various different forms, and the lost rivers are lost countryside. These two books, which I've written over the last 10 years, as Neil said, are attempts to understand how rivers that we think have vanished are actually still present in the city around us in less than apparent ways, but they are still there and you can track them through the modern streetscape. So they're books of history because you need to understand the history that's taken a river from flowing above ground to flowing somewhere beneath our feet. But they're also about the city now. They're about understanding what we see around us through a different lens. My interest in lost rivers came from, first of all, trying to track them for myself. So I tried to follow the Effra, which is a river close to where I live in South London. It's flowing underground in the storm sewer system and has been since the 19th century, when London grew and rivers became a problem very quickly. They were put underground in stages, bit by bit, and eventually incorporated into the sewer system that was built from the 1860s. But you can still see their presence in the city. So I was in West Norwood trying to understand why there was a house called the Boathouse on West Norwood High Street, with apparently no water anywhere close by. And when I understood that it was a house that had been on the banks of a now lost river, I began to try and piece together the story of the Effra and the places it went to. So I went up to the top of the hill in Crystal Palace, to the highest point where the Effra has its source. And once you're there, you can follow downhill something that quickly becomes a valley that's got a river still flowing at the bottom of it, out of sight. This is the Talveg. The Talveg is a very useful term for the low point that runs along the course of a river. It's a sort of mystical thing, really, in London, because you know you're following something that you can't see. These low points form very distinct valleys, and you can track them sometimes through open space, sometimes along roads, sometimes under houses and buildings that have been put over the course of the river. But once you start to see that in the landscape, you can't unsee it. And a London that was once much more up, much more down, had much more in the way of hills and valleys and a clear landscape character, starts to reveal itself again. And following the Effra unlocked lots of different places. I found a drain cover off Central Hill, the bottom of a suburban street, which had a very loud sound of rushing water underneath it, something very big, clearly going downhill, down quite a steep part of the hill at that point. And I found a hidden graveyard which the river ran around at the back of a convent full of the graves of forgotten nuns. I found history around West Norwood and the problems the river had caused till the 1920s when it flooded on a fairly spectacular level, and indeed once supposedly flooded the roasting joints out of people's ovens at a Sunday lunchtime. And then if you follow it through West Norwood Cemetery, this great depression running through the cemetery, you can see the course of the river, you can see it running across roads which slope mysteriously, suddenly up and then suddenly down. Through Herne Hill, you can see where it flowed around what was described once as an island. It's now Island Green, a traffic island, in fact, but was once an actual island, at least in certain seasons. And really, I realized I found a map that unlocked the city for me, that made sense of the place around me in a way that I hadn't been able to access before. And it's a literal map. In some ways. This is the river map put together by Nicholas Barton in his book on London rivers, which for years was the only book covering this ground, published first in the 1960s, still being reprinted. But the thing about this map, which shows lots of rivers, all of which are more or less below ground, there's a few on the outskirts here which aren't, but in the centre of London here, you've got things like the Fleet, the Tyburn, the Westbourne, the Stamford Brook, the Neckinger, the Effra, which are all rivers that are essentially buried. This map is trying to see London as it was before people lived here, because as soon as London began to become a city, these rivers started to vanish. The Walbrook, which runs through the city, was the river around which London was founded. Roman London is founded around the point where the Walbrook meets the Thames. But it started to disappear in very, very early times, and was last seen above ground in the 15th century. So this map is an act of creative conjecture, trying to understand where rivers might have flown, where there was no one around to see them, so certainly no one around to map them. This is a landscape from the deep past, effectively, trying to understand London prehistory. And that's not only fascinating as a way of thinking of the city, but also fascinating when you try and reconstruct it, when you try and understand where the water is today, and where it can still be seen. There were a lot of drain covers in London which looked pretty unpromising at first glance, but these are the keys to what's underneath, to the parallel world that's just below our feet. This is on this particular one, Marylebone Lane. And Marylebone Lane, if you look at the map of London, snakes across the grid that was built around it. So when Marylebone was constructed, the Tyburn River was covered over and put at the backs of houses which were planned on a rational grid system. Their fronts were designed to be seen. They faced new, relatively broad streets, but Marylebone Lane is narrow around the back and follows a completely different path. And it shows quite clearly where the Tyburn still is. And if you try and listen to this particular drain cover, it's got down the middle of the road, it's a bit difficult, there's often quite a lot of traffic. It's also outside a pub, so people tend to want to know what on earth you're doing. You can hear what's going on. You can hear the river, you can hear the water passing through, you can hear the Tyburn still flowing as a living river. And that's the case with all these lost rivers. They were covered over because they were effectively the sewage system for London. That's where rubbish, sewage, animal carcasses, the Fleet in particular received the carcasses from Smithfield Market and all the remains from the live slaughter that took place there in the first half of the 19th century. They were filthy and dangerous and unhealthy. And naturally, people thought that they needed to be covered over, put away, put out of sight. And when London actually acquired a sewer system that can manage these rivers, they simply became the storm sewers, which take the overflow, extra water, which reaches the system when it rains, and it overflows the normal capacity of the tunnels. So these rivers still flow underground. There's less water than there once was, but there's still plenty. This is a tunnel that contains the River Fleet. And I've been down into the Fleet sewer a couple of times. You have to get suited up with Thames Water and take down protective equipment and all sorts of things like that. And this includes weighted boots. And when you get down there, you realize why, because the water flows fast enough to take you off your feet. And if you're not wearing weighted boots, you can't get a purchase on these round profile tunnel floors. So you feel like you're in a place that has something wild and untamable going on in it. And it really is a separate world that doesn't get seen from the surface very often at all. If you peer down some drain covers, ones with open gratings, you can see the water flowing. Increasingly, these are being covered over, though. A bit disappointing, really. They're an older sort of drain cover, and in recent years, quite a few good views of the Neckinger and the Fleet have disappeared. But no, beneath the pavements that people think they know extremely well is something completely different that shows that really when these rivers were flowing above ground, the neighbourhoods that they belonged to were entirely different places. They were more governed by the weather. They were related directly to water. They had water running through them for better and for worse. So a lot of the places that had rivers as part of them were slums, because in central London, the houses tended to be badly built until the current wave of rebuilding before the Victorians improved incrementally large sections of central London by demolishing them. The buildings that they contained were often predominantly wooden, and they suffered greatly from the water that ran underneath. Obviously, there was a lot of pollution. They were places on the edge. They were marginal, really, and the rivers are margins too. They're boundaries, dividing lines. Quite often, London boroughs have boundaries that run along the lines of rivers that have long vanished from sight. So these rivers still shape London the way it's governed. They divided land ownership right from the start, and they still divide London into places that we all recognise as separate. And they have a presence. They still confer identity, really. People know about their local rivers. Even when they're buried, people have quite often a clear awareness that there is something there. The Effra is sort of part of local folklore in Brixton, parts of South London, Herne Hill. People know there's something underground. Occasionally, the power of the river is invoked. Protesters have often, in the last 30 years or so, used buried rivers as symbols of the spirit of the City of London, which is something you can deploy against the G10, for example, during the 90s, street protests, or reclaim the streets style actions. So there's a residual idea that rivers still have power. And they belong in places that at first don't seem to have anything to do with the river. And when you look again, you realise that that's all they're about. So this is Holborn Viaduct, which is a prime example. It's a bridge. What's a bridge doing crossing a busy street in central London? It's, I took it for granted and thought, well, this is just some sort of bit of Victorian engineering, perhaps a bit over elaborate, but it's not. It's a bridge that crosses on the site of many bridges before it, the Fleet Valley, and the Fleet opened up from here down to the Thames at Blackfriars. It was quite a wide area of river. It had docks alongside it. It was central London docklands where key materials and food and supplies were unloaded in the Middle Ages. The stones that built the old St. Paul's Cathedral were unloaded at wharves along the Fleet. And there are lanes heading off Farringdon Road called things like Stonecutter Lane, Limeburner Lane, Newcastle Lane for the coals that came down, which give you a sense of what used to go on here. But the river's covered over now. It's in two large parallel tunnels running all the way down here because one isn't enough to contain the amount of water that comes down. But they're there. The bridge still crosses the river valley, and the width of the river valley is really evident in the height of the bridge because it has to cross a really quite steep decline. This is the western boundary of Roman London. It was a useful defensive boundary because of the steepness of the Fleet Gorge, and the gorge is still there, just sort of beyond normal understanding and perception. But when you see it, you can't unsee it. So the loss of these rivers is something that's, I think, becoming more and more current. The price that we paid for the economy we've got now through the Industrial Revolution, all the things that came during the 19th century, the enormous economic growth of London, it was an ecological price as much as anything else. And the landscape around us was completely reshaped, including our water systems. And there's now a lot of discussion about how rivers that aren't completely buried can be brought above ground, and also a kind of a wish to return rivers to the surface, to daylight rivers, as it's known, that have been long buried. That's generally pretty impractical because they're incorporated into the sewer system, but there are many rivers around the edges of London, edges of inner London, which are, rather than buried, ignored, so put in concrete culverts behind houses and not allowed to create a natural environment and to help deal with the rainwater that comes down, that we have problems from keeping out of people's basements. The main issues that Thames Water has to deal with at the moment are effectively around the drainage of the Lost River valleys, the flooding that plagues certain parts of London is down to the missing rivers and the management of water that would once have gone into them. So they're both an historical curiosity, but also a living and current part of the city, the way it works, and the questions we have to answer about the sort of place we want it to be in future. And I'm going to finish up with this. So on the foreshore by Vauxhall Bridge, the River Effra runs out into the Thames. There are two outlets either side of Vauxhall Bridge, although the Thames Tideway works are changing this bit of foreshore significantly at the moment. But this is where the first evidence of settlement in London is to be found. So the first buildings that we know, or structures that were being built by people settling in London, have been found here at very low tides on the foreshore, timbers that date from the Mesolithic era, so 3,000 years ago, when people were hunter-gatherers just beginning to settle down. And we know that they settled beside the river, but not just the Thames, they settled where the Effra joins the Thames in the Effra Delta, probably on some kind of island. There may well have been a causeway across the Thames here. So understanding the presence of these rivers is a key to knowing the place that we live in, to understanding how we came to be here, what people are doing in this particular location in the first place. And rivers, I think, also carry a remaining element of the wildness that came before civilization arrived, before cities grew and became dominant. They contain a spirit of place that is valuable. It's valuable in helping people understand their connection to the places around them, how their neighborhood works, where water goes, but also what meaning people took from places that they settled long ago. And water is always at the key of that. It's a essential facility. It's something you absolutely need, but it's also a symbolic thing as well. It gives you the idea of a journey to another place. It gives you the idea of a portal through to different worlds. And I think the fascination of the Lost Rivers lies in their presence and their absence together, the fact that we know they're there, but we can't see them. So I'll stop there, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, for a fantastic introductory presentation, which I think opens up all sorts of fascinating issues for discussion. As you say, rivers still have power, and not just physical power, but psychological power, and a power to influence the way in which we perceive and engage with places across the capital and across the country, which is a fantastic note on which to end. We're going to move swiftly on to our second speaker this evening, author Lara Makelem, otherwise known as the Thames Mudlark, and maybe many other things. I'm not sure, but welcome, Lara. Lara's the author of the best-selling book Mudlarking, which was a Radio 4 Book of the Week a short while ago, and it's a true treasure trove of stories and history associated with the River Thames, told through the objects, many of them very small, that she has found while exploring the foreshore of the river. And she has a new book just published, I believe, called A Field Guide to Larking, which you'll no doubt talk about as well. Lara, I'm going to hand over to you now and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Neil. I'm just going to grapple with the technology here and attempt to share my PowerPoint with everyone. Hold on a minute. Get started with this. Right. Okay, well, thank you very much, Neil. And thank you, Tom. I have a fascination with the Lost Rivers, and I'm incredibly jealous that you've been down into the sewers, because I've been trying to get down there for years, and I'm just thwarted every time I try. Anyway, a while back, Neil, you asked me to talk about the rivers, and it got me thinking about how important rivers have been to me throughout my life, and I thought I'm going to go back and I'm going to talk about the importance of rivers and the part and the role that they've played since really I was tiny. And we'll start with this picture of me on my first love. This is the first river I really fell in love with. It's the one I grew up with. It was one that ran behind the back of the house where I was born, and it's the River Sal. It's in Surrey. It's very small. It's more of a stream really than a river. And I spent hours on this river when I was a child. Obviously now my special river is the Thames, but this was my first love. I'd sit there in the evenings, I'd watch the river voles plopping into the water, water snakes sometimes swimming upstream, and great big fluorescent dragonflies that just seemed to be everywhere. Perhaps it was just my very halcyon memories of the river, but they seem to be everywhere in these gorgeous fluorescent summers. And if we were lucky, sometimes the blue flash of a kingfisher. I made rafts. I played on the river. Sometimes I fell into it. It wasn't the cleanest river back then in the 70s and 80s. Goodness knows what was going into it, but I loved the river. The smell of the river, that is what makes me think of home. It comforts me and reminds me of the peace I've always found on riverbanks. Fast forward to the early 1990s, and that's when I moved to London. And I was missing the river. I was missing the farm I grew up on. I was missing the peace and solitude that I found there. But I moved to London for the bright lights and the big city. But as I say, something was missing. And I searched for it in the gardens and the parks and the heaths of London, but they were just somehow just too crowded. There were too many people. They were too manicured. And then I found the Thames. And the Thames for 20 years now has been my special place. It's been the place that I've gone to for peace and for solitude. When I first found it, I was meeting a friend down on a riverside pub. She was late as usual, and I was staring out across this great expanse of water, and it just occurred to me that right here in the middle of the river is this fantastic space, this huge streak of nothingness, where I could get away from people. Which is all I wanted, really. And for years, I walked the Thames Path, which, if anyone's familiar with it, it goes for miles and miles along the river, and you can really get away from the city along there. And the foreshore for me at that point seemed really out of bounds, somewhere that I wasn't allowed. You weren't allowed down there. For some reason, it was dangerous. I'd worked out that the river went up and down. It was tidal, but for some reason, I thought I wasn't allowed down onto the foreshore, until one day I found myself at the top of a set of rickety old wooden stairs, looking down onto the foreshore and thinking to myself, well, why not? And I went down, and I should actually be moving these along. There we go, there's the river. And I thought to myself, why not? I'm going to go down there. And I went down some rivers. At the end of this alleyway, actually, there's some river stairs, very much like the ones that I was standing at. And I thought, let's go down there and see what's down there. And the first thing I found was a clay pipe stem. And it seemed sensible to me that there was a lot more to find. And every time I went back, I found something new, something different. And it became an obsession for me. Going back again and again, each time finding something different. And these were the lost and discarded objects that told stories of the forgotten lives of Londoners, of ordinary people who really left nothing more behind to say that they were here than maybe a ring with their initials graved on it, a worn out shoe, a broken knife, or perhaps even a lost flint scraper. And these were the things that they'd lost in the river, or perhaps that they'd thrown away. Because of course, London is the best place in the world to mudlark. Not just because of the tides that go up and down twice a day and let us down onto the river bed itself to search for the objects that have been lost over really 2,000 years by people working and travelling and living along the river. But because London is really only here because of the river. If you look down on London from space, the only recognisable thing is the Thames, snaking its way through the river, through this sort of mass or urban mass. The Romans founded London because of the river. They founded Londinium as a trading port because they could get their ships up this wide spreading river. They could bring trade from the empire and take valuable things like lead and tin and slaves away from Britannia. By the 18th century, London had become the largest and greatest port in the world because of the Thames. It's hosted fantastic floating pageants, frost fairs, and even executions. We've built bridges across it. We've dug tunnels underneath it. We've narrowed it, we've poisoned it, and we've worshipped it for 2,000 years. But for a while in the 1960s, ships stopped coming. The wharfs closed, and for a little while we forgot about the river. It became an annoyance, something to get across, getting stuck into traffic jams. And a lot of people, they maybe don't even notice it. People who live in London, it's just something that just has always been there. They don't notice it. But the heart, apart from the history that the river contains, it's also a streak of nature that runs through our city. It's a national park, really, in our midst. It's a reminder of the seasons. It's a place that you can go to feel the rain on your skin and the wind unhindered by tall buildings. There are seahorses in the river even. I've seen porpoises under the Millennium Bridge and seals hauled up onto the foreshore in Richmond. Sometimes, if you're lucky, flatfish flip over your Wellington boots in the shallows, and cormorants pop up from the water wrestling with eels. And all of this I find incredibly grounding. This is why I go to the river. For me, it's an escape from the city. When I lived in London, it was my escape. Ironically, now I've moved out of London. It's really the only thing that draws me back into the city. For me, it's a great place of meditation. It's a place I can escape from life. I can get back to being me. I can have a few hours of just doing something and nothing. And it's a history. The history that you find on the river is a reminder of our permanence or impermanence, whichever way you want to look. That people are the same, whatever era they happen to live in. They have the same desires and fears. And this I find incredibly comforting. The fact that the river is constantly changing and moving is both powerful and patient. The river is eternal. It will be here. It was here long before we were here, and it will be here long after we're gone. And the river really being my special place is what inspired me to write my book, Mudlarking. And I'd like to read a little bit, finish up by reading just a little bit from it about the fog, which I hope really conjures something to the spirit of the Thames, the spirit that I feel for my special place in London. It's about the fog. The fog had begun to roll in, obscuring the Dartford crossing, the last bridge on the Thames. It was the same fog that had settled on the river since the first primordial trickle began to cut a course through the London clay, and the forests I had been looking at covered its banks. The Thames is famous for its fogs, which creep silently over the channel and smother the foreshore, a great white cloud of damp river breath, thick and consuming, filling ears and covering eyes, curling down throats and settling on lungs. Thames fogs can feel unbearably claustrophobic, too intimate, and too invasive. But they also offer comfort and security, a soft white pocket in which to escape from the world. When the fog is very thick and visibility is down to no more than a few yards, the discernible space is all that exists. There is no city, no traffic, and not another soul. The only reminder of the world outside are occasional muffled sounds, damp and distorted, coming from every direction and from nowhere. The cry of lost seagulls, muted shouts from men on riverside building sites, their hammers padded and soft, and passing boats, horns sounding in the distance, invisible engines growing louder as they pass then fade away, leaving waves in their wake that lap at the foreshore like a dog worrying a wound. Time stands still in the fog, with all modern points of reference obscured, mist. The river is ageless, static and ghostly. The spirits of the foreshore ride up in the mists just out of sight. Through the swirling whiteness, a medieval fisherman pegs his fish traps to the riverbed. A Victorian scavenger wanders barefoot through the mud, and a Georgian shipwright checks the hull of his newly built ship. On the river, invisible galleons and sailing barges glide past. Wherries are carried swiftly downstream on the retreating tide, and a phantom paddle steamer pushes through the currents. Thames fogs are quite literally the mists of time. They are daydreams manifested, swirling visions of the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, and for that really deep and fascinating sort of personal reflection on what the River Thames means to you, and a wonderful passage to read to finish off with. Thank you very much for that. I just wanted to remind people listening in, please do post any questions in the Q&A panel. We have a couple already there. Raise any issues you want to raise as well there, and we can come to those once we've heard from our third and final speaker this evening. We now come to Tom Chivers, who is a poet and arts producer, whose new book, London Clay, has Journeys into a Deep City is the subtitle, has just come out. And it's a fantastic read. It combines historical research, a reportage and personal memoir, and charts a rich and compelling journey through the capital, guided by its geology, geomorphology, and of course its rivers and waterways. I'm going to hand over to Tom Chivers now, and look forward to hearing what you have to say, Tom.
Thank you so much, Neil, and lovely to be here. Thank you for tuning in. I mean, Tom or Lara are a pretty hard act to follow, so to follow both of them is an impossible act. As Neil said, I recently published this book, London Clay, Journeys in the Deep City. And I hold it up for two reasons. First of all, for advertisement purposes, but secondly, because it's absolutely knackered already, even though it's only about a month old. And that's because it's been journeying with me down the River Lee on a walk I did a couple of weeks ago. To give you a bit of an overview of London Clay, it's a book about what lies beneath our feet in the city, about the layers of history and archaeology and geology, but also of the urban myths and the folklore and the memories that we all make when we live in or work in or visit London. And how all of those layers interact with how we engage with the city now, how it feels to walk through the city. So it's not a comprehensive book. It's not a guidebook. It's more a kind of a deep dive into how it feels to walk along ancient routes and kind of exploring the industrial edgelands of the city. But really, all the places that I went to whilst writing the book stemmed from thinking about the underlying geology of London, and that led me to research some fascinating places, including Roman roads, temples, ruined playhouses, and so on. And obviously the rivers of London, the lost rivers of London, as Tom has brilliantly written about for so many years, feature very heavily in the book. But there are also other geological features that interest me, and that together give us a sense of London. To steal the Museum of London's own phrase, London before London. So the London, the natural landscape that would have greeted the first Roman colonizers back in the 1st century AD. Those include not only the rivers, but also lost islands and various geological anomalies that are known as drift hollows or drift-filled hollows. And I suppose one of my arguments in the book that these places have become sites of a kind of a sort of a lost or occulted power or magic. And I know that Tom used, I think, the word mystical in his talk, which I concur with. So that's really London Clay. But my own relationship with rivers, I was thinking about what Neil said to the three of us before this talk. He gave us a kind of provocation to talk about what rivers mean to us, which Lara responded to so beautifully with that photograph of yourself on your local river. And Neil also mentioned that I'm a poet, and I certainly was a poet. I haven't written poems for a long time, but I wanted actually to refer to a poem that means a lot to me, which has a river in it, and also pertains to loss, because Tom's work is all about lost rivers. Lara's work is all about lost objects, and loss and the river is very important to me as well. And the poem anyway is called Pearl, and some of you might know it. This is my old edition, which is together with two other poems, Gawain and the Green Knight, and I think it's Cleanness and Patience as well, all written probably by the same person in the late 14th century. So we're talking about, what's that, 750 years ago, probably a little bit before the time of Geoffrey Chaucer, and the language is actually harder to understand than Chaucer. And this is a poem anyway, Pearl, which is a dream vision, and it's about a character who enters a vision, a kind of mystical landscape full of gleaming cliffs, and it's a dream landscape through which a small river is running. And he describes this river incredibly beautifully, and I'm going to read a tiny bit, hopefully not in too terrible an accent. He describes the river containing pebbles that are gleaming like gems. And I think Lara will particularly like this as somebody who spends a lot of time staring at submerged items in water. The poet writes, "For uch a pebble in pool there picht was emerald, sapphire, other gemmer gente, that alle the loch limed of licht." That alle the loch limed of licht. Loch is the same word as in the Scots, loch, meaning all the lake gleamed with light. And I particularly love that line. It brings together light and water, which is so important. And in the poem, the dreamer has lost an item. So again, connecting back to Lara's work, and I'm also a Thames Mudlark, although very much an apprentice one. And the dreamer has lost his pearl, which, as the poem goes on, we realise is in fact a symbol. It's not a real gemstone. It's the symbol of his lost daughter, of his dead child. And the river, which appears so beautiful and so striking in the opening of the poem, then becomes a boundary. It becomes a border, and the dreamer sees a vision of his dead daughter wearing all white on the other side of the river, and of course the river he cannot cross. So again, kind of connects strangely with I think both Tom and Lara's work. So that poem Pearl has really, I think, really stayed with me over the years, and kind of connects with the second chapter in London Clay, which is about loss and rivers. I grew up in a place called Herne Hill, which Tom mentioned earlier on. Herne Hill being the meeting place of two branches of the underground river Effra. And Tom mentioned flooding in Herne Hill. I certainly remember that a little bit when I was growing up. And in fact, he talked about island Green. Herne Hill used to be known as Island Green because there was this little bit of land caught between the two tributaries. And I actually used to run a poetry night there about 15 years ago, which was in a bar in a converted railway arch right there where Island Green used to be, and it was called Island Arts Centre. So called because it was named after the island on which one of the owners was born, which I think was probably Barbados or maybe Trinidad. So, you know, this is what I'm struck by, is sometimes the way in which the kind of this submerged history can re-emerge in surprising ways in language and in names. Anyway, so I grew up in Herne Hill, and in the second chapter of the book, I wanted to go back to South London, and I wanted to trace two of these branches of the River Effra. One of them, and I don't have slides, I've got printouts, so I'm going to hold them up kind of awkwardly to the camera. I trace one of these branches up to an extraordinary urban woodland called Dulwich and Sydenham Hill Wood. And when I was a teenager, I used to bunk off school and go and drink cheap spirits and read poetry in this urban woodland. And here it is, if you can see that. Now, what you're seeing here is a tiny stream called the Ambrook, A-M Brook. And this is a tributary of the Effra. So it's a tributary of the Thames. And when I was growing up, I didn't really know about the Ambrook. I knew there was a stream. I had no idea of its name. And so I wanted in this chapter to go and find the source of the Ambrook, and to try as well to explore, to ask myself why I was so fascinated by landscapes in the city, and whether it had any connection with my childhood and with the loss of my mother to cancer when I was 13. And so I went and spent some time in Dulwich Woods, and then I went across to the other branch of the Effra, which, as Tom mentioned before, goes through West Norwood Cemetery, which is where my mother is buried. And that chapter is a kind of meditation on death, on grief, and on landscape. And I used to have this recurring dream when I was a kid that my mother's coffin, she's buried at the top of this hill overlooking the valley of the Effra. I had this recurring dream that her coffin, the hill suddenly sort of collapsed, and I would be standing there watching the coffin kind of falling into a void in the hill. And of course, when it disappeared, I would then wake up in a cold sweat. And it was only a few years later, when I started to get into the Lost Rivers in a big way, that I heard the urban myth about coffins actually falling into the underground River Effra and being transported all the way to the mouth of the river at Vauxhall. There's no proof that this happened, but this strange coincidence of my dream, also connecting to the dream vision of Pearl, and then connecting to the urban myth that I found out about later. So for me, the river, the rivers in general, rivers in London, again, thinking about that provocation that Neil has given us, for me, the river is a paradox. I think echoing Lara's words on this, the river is something that is constantly changing, it's dynamic, and it carries things, it bears things, and it bears things away from itself. But it is also in that movement something that is creating this mark on the land that is, if not permanent, is certainly very ancient. Lara talked at the end about how the River Thames will be here, will be here long after we've gone, and I've no doubt that's the case. Although, of course, thinking from the perspective of deep time, of geology, the River Thames wasn't always where it is now. So whilst I have no doubt the River Thames, in some respect, will be here, for millions of years, it may not be running in the course that it is currently seen, from above in that classic shot from EastEnders. So I'm going to finish with reading a little section, which I hope will. I was going to read something about the foreshore because of Lara's involvement, and I'm so inspired by her book and by her work generally as a mudlark. But in fact, I'm going to read a little bit about the Effra. And this is just when I was following the Effra, so as I said, I grew up in Herne Hill, which is where these two branches reach their confluence. What I didn't realize is my parents separated when I was about 10, and I lived for a number of years, partly in West Norwood, and I lived on this road called Hexham Road, and I didn't realize that actually the Effra went underneath the road. So this is the end of this section in the book to do with my mother and the River Effra. And I mentioned a chap called Colin, who is one of these fantastic local historians who knows everything that there is to know about West Norwood. Later that day, energized by meeting Colin, I traced the Effra downstream by instinct alone and find myself back at the terraced house I shared with my mother in her final years. A loft extension has been put in and the scrappy little garden much refreshed. Round the back, by a row of sullen garages where I used to practice skateboarding every evening, I find a metal disc sunk into a pavement slab to mark the buried river. The front door my mother had installed has been painted black. I'm sure no one is at home. On the tarmac outside, children have drawn a colossal imaginary creature in many shades of chalk, inspired, I imagine, by the famous dinosaur sculptures of Crystal Palace Park. 2 doors down, a woman is taking her rubbish out. There, in the middle of Hexham Road, I see another manhole. The woman goes back inside. I walk into the middle of the road, check for traffic, and lie down on my front. I can hear it straight away, the rush of a river, like radio static, like the hiss of a tape that has come to an end. The tarmac is warm against my skin, and then, in the background, I make out a deeper sound, something banging in the darkness. A sluice, perhaps, forced open by the weight of water falling downriver. Thank you.
Wow, fantastic, Tom. Thank you so much. And I'm delighted to say that we've had some very positive comments put into the chat bar about all of the presentations. I'll just read a small quote from one of the attendees who says, "The three panelists are together such an extraordinary team of knowledge and perspective," which I'm sure many of us would agree with. That's a wonderful set of presentations, and set us up, I think, for an interesting discussion over the next half an hour or so. And I'm pleased to say we do have a few questions that have been put into the Q&A panel, and I'm going to see if we can sort of take them in sort of fairly logical order if we can. Perhaps starting off with a more specific question aimed at Lara from somebody called Emma, who asks you, Lara, that she said you mentioned that the Thames was worshipped, and she's asking what items have you found that relate to that worship, please? And of course, if either Tom Chivers or Tom Bolton, I'm going to call them Tom C and Tom B for ease, would like to chip in on any of these questions, please, or this question, please do so. Lara, can you answer that? Are you there? You'll need to put take yourself off.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Yes, I mean, of course, the Thames has been a greatly revered and spiritual place since prehistory. That there have been found some incredible Bronze Age objects. The Waterloo helmet, the Battersea shields were objects that were ritually thrown in. As far as objects that I've found that were probably thrown in as offerings, when it's thought that the Romans built the first bridge across the Thames, and it's thought that there was a shrine partway across simply because so many Roman coins have been found in the river around the area where the old Roman bridge was. When they took down the medieval bridge and they dredged out all the silt, hundreds of years of silt that had grown up around the Starlings, they were pulling up Roman coins by the bucketful, which is why they think that the Romans did have a habit of making offerings to water, that they were just flicking in a low denomination coin. And I found plenty of Roman coins on the foreshore. Fast forward to the medieval period, and the returning pilgrims are thought to have offered the pilgrim badges that they bought at the shrines that they visited. Most of them went down to, well, a lot of them went down to Becket Shrine in Canterbury, and they left from Borough, from the medieval bridge. There was again a chapel this time, partway across the medieval bridge for St Thomas Becket, and they'd leave from there, go down to Canterbury. They'd buy a pewter pilgrim badge, which really was just a bit of like buying a fridge magnet or rubber when you go to the zoo today. They'd buy one of those. It was cheap. It brought back a little bit of the magic of the shrine, and it's thought that they'd throw them into the river as a thanks for a safe return, and because a number of them have been found ritually bent as well. And I found a few pilgrim badges now. Today, the river has been blessed by the Hindu community. It is a place that they go, substitute for the Ganges, and mudlarks do find an awful lot of modern, particularly Hindu offerings. I've also found Taoist offerings, Islamic, Christian, Wiccan, you name it. Everyone seems to be going down there. The river really is a special and very spiritual place for a lot of people today, probably almost more today than it has been since maybe prehistoric times.
Fantastic. That demonstrates the richness of your research, I think, Laura, more than anything. So thank you for that. We've got a couple of questions, more specific questions to go. Another one for Tom B. From Annie Codgel, who asks, how well signposted are the Lost Rivers? Do you feel they should be better known? I guess by which you mean on in terms of physically on the surface.
Yeah, I mean, it's very variable. In some ways, I'm in two minds about how well signposted a river should be, because the thrill of discovering them and not thinking that anybody else knows they're there is part of the fun. Although having written guided walks along them, I can't really take the moral high ground on that, I suppose. But there are plaques along parts of the Fleet, for example. Camden, the borough of Camden, went through a period of marking its route with pavements and roundels. But the thing I think that you can do most easily is follow paths along rivers that are only partly buried. So there's a lot of kind of in between, rivers that have disappeared under the surface at one end but reappeared at the other. And the Wandle is a very good example of that. So the Wandle is under Croydon. Used to cause Croydon all sorts of problems, enormous amounts of flooding, more coffins floating out of graves, in fact. And then after it leaves Croydon, it comes back above ground, and it's been an industrialised river for most of its existence. The industry's not really using the river anymore. There's a lot of things along it, quite a lot of redevelopment too. But there's a very good path all the way along the Wandle, and that's a national trail. So there are rivers that you can walk very happily in London. They're very different experiences. I mean, the Wandle is a piece of wildness, it really is. You see kingfishers on the Wandle. I've only ever seen kingfishers on the Wandle, never anywhere else. And parts of it are beautiful. Parts of it are also full of clouds of midges, which is definitely authentic river countryside experience. But it's a real kind of green lung. It's a place that people flocked to during lockdown because they suddenly realised they have this amazing green space on their doorstep that they'd always ignored. So there are river walking experiences which are essentially classic countryside walks, but in London and extremely accessible. And then there are walking experiences that are sort of acts of urban exploration, where you have to take it on faith that there was once a river there and look occasionally for the signs that you're right. So I think there's room for all of this really, but there are, I think, more walks being developed along the routes of some of these rivers as part of the National Trails system in London. There was some coverage of this earlier in the year. So you've got the London Loop, you've got the London Orbital, you've got paths that are quite well known. And added to that, there are 2 or 3 new paths that follow parts of the routes of rivers that have disappeared below ground.
Thanks, Tom. And I would add to that, from a CPRE London perspective, we're working with the Ramblers and others to promote a more extensive green walking network across London with TfL and the GLA. And there is a map that the Ramblers have produced of potential new walking routes of that kind, some of which, as you say, follow the tracks of exposed or hidden rivers. So that's really good. Actually, this is one for you, Tom Chivers, Tom C, from perhaps Leslie McDonald, who's asking, what was one of the most interesting urban myths you came across? I think this is probably best directed at you, but Tom B and Lara, if you want to chip in, please do.
Yeah, lots of them, and I suppose I was particularly interested in those ones where I felt I could add something that was maybe, it goes back to the idea of paradox. People often don't take urban myths very seriously if they come from a scientific background. And I was always interested in exploring both the geography and geology, which are scientific pursuits, with these urban myths. And the one that is coming to mind is to do with, it's one of the kind of springs or wells of London called Black Mary's Hole. It's up towards King's Cross, just south of King's Cross, and it was one of these kind of springs, kind of early springs. But it's got such a curious name, Black Mary's Hole. It's also near somewhere a little bit better known called Bagnage Wells, which was properly developed into a kind of suburban spa in, I think, the 18th century. Tom may correct me on that one. But Black Mary's Hole was fascinating, and there are various myths or kind of theories about why it's called Black Mary's Hole. Some people thought that actually there was a black woman who lived there and was kind of the guardian of the hole, which is obviously quite a fairly unusual thing in 18th century London. Others that it was to do with the black hooded nuns from St Mary's Priory down in Clerkenwell. So no one really knows, but what I discovered, I don't really know whether I want to give this away, hell I will, in the book, that Black Mary's Hole, which is quite an unusual area. It feels quite strange when you walk through it. I discovered that area is actually underlain by one of these geological anomalies known as a drift-filled hollow. Basically, it's a depression in the ground filled with drift material, which is what geologists refer to as something that it's a material that has filled in a pre-existing depression, basically. And again, no one quite knows why these depressions exist across London, but I found it curious that it was in the same location as Black Mary's Hole.
Great, well, thank you very much. I think we've still got some fantastic questions coming in. And most of them now, I think, are pointing to the future, I think this is probably a good moment just to remind ourselves of the three key themes of London Rivers Week this week, which are promoting access to nature and green space and blue space, which is probably all experienced in recent times has been particularly important with the pandemic and the lockdown and so on, with more and more people getting out into London's open spaces to benefit from them in all sorts of ways. The second key theme is around climate change and the need for London to become a more resilient city in the face of inevitable climate change, whatever happens next week at COP 26. But and then the third one is around health and well-being and around how can we make the most of London's rivers and waterscapes to improve public health and well-being. And we had a very interesting webinar on that very topic earlier in the week. So with those themes in mind, we'll come to the next questions, really. And one here from Dave Webb, who I know is from the Environment Agency and has been a driving force behind London Rivers Week. And he's asking a very interesting question, really, which I think links the past and the future. And he says, do you think there is a narrative of rivers transforming from hazard to asset? And if so, why? I don't know who I'd like to invite to tackle that one first. Tom, Tom C, you've got your mics on still, so maybe I can start with you. Do you think that's a narrative that you recognise?
Yes, I mean, I'm thinking it's a tricky one. I mean, Tom B mentioned daylighting, which is this practice of restoring so-called lost or buried rivers, and it's a fascinating one. There have been various plans to do this, which I suppose is a way of turning a hazard into an asset. And I'm never quite when you talk about the inner London lost rivers, I'm never quite convinced. There was a plan to turn the River Fleet into an open river in a kind of wider scheme to turn Farringdon into a kind of version of Venice. which seemed to me pretty far-fetched. And I think some of these things are far-fetched, but I think there's also a power in proposing things that won't necessarily happen. Tom also mentioned some of the activism work around the Lost Rivers, and I think he mentioned the Reclaim the Streets protest that happened in the late 90s maybe, and certainly one of my early encounters with the Lost River EFRA was through the EFRA, I think it was called the EFRA Restoration Site Office or something like that. It was basically a group of activists hired a space on Brixton High Street, and they weren't actually restoring the river, but the point is that the conceit of it was powerful, and I think the goal of it was to transform minds rather than to literally daylight the river. So I think in a way, turning hazards into assets, I think we have to start with the imagination before we actually embark on any huge engineering projects.
Yeah, thanks. Interesting one. I've just pasted in the chat bar some data from the Catchment Partnerships in London group, which illustrates that whilst London has 400 miles of waterways, over the last 20 years we've seen 28 miles of those rivers, canals, and wetlands created or restored, and there is definitely a movement towards restoration, driven by targets in the London Plan. And the Catchment Partnerships Group want to increase the restoration rate over the next 20 years from 3 kilometres a year to 5 kilometres a year. So I think there's a real force behind that. But we certainly take your point about starting with the imagination. I think that's a key one.
Can I also just very briefly add that in the last chapter in London Clay, I went to the River Lee, which is not a landscape I knew very well, but I met a remarkable man called Theo Thomas, who is known as the London Waterkeeper. It's a fantastic title, which kind of puts you in mind of medieval beadles and watchmen and stuff like that. And Theo basically runs a very, very small charity looking after London's waterways, and he spends a lot of time measuring levels of toxicity in the River Lee, in the Bowback rivers and other waterways. And I think that there is a real risk when we start to move from hazard to asset, that we do it in a way that is unsustainable. And certainly a lot of his research, a lot of him standing in and above the Lee, putting devices into it, have yielded pretty unsatisfactory results. And it looks like some of those waterways in the Olympic Park, which were heralded, still are heralded as wetlands, full of beautiful wildflower meadows and so on, are actually full of effluent.
There is definitely a problem living near there. I know I can vouch for that. But my perspective is that by revealing this problem, you focus attention on what solutions we can bring to it, and we might come to a question later on about current or recent debates in Parliament about duties on water companies to deal with sewage. But Lara or Laura, do you want to come in on this one?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of hazards and assets, I mean, I might be going a little bit off piece here, but I mean, the river has certainly become an asset in as much as it's becoming privatised. The riverbanks are becoming privatised. The river really is becoming, particularly the Thames, a place for people who can afford it. Really, you have to be quite wealthy to live along the river these days. And some of these, you see it when you try and walk the Thames path, they're actively trying to block people from access to the river. So, as the river becomes an asset, it becomes more attractive to people, and it becomes the sort of place that really only rich people can afford, and they start to barricade it against other people. So, in that respect, is it, becoming an asset, that sort of asset, is it a good thing?
Yeah, I think an important distinction to be made between private and public assets, and I think the Thames Path Trail was clearly a fantastic effort decades ago to actually make the Thames into more of a public asset, and you're right to draw attention to problems associated with perhaps gentrification and acquisition of expensive Thameside properties.
I think
gives me sorry Tom, I'll bring you in a moment. It just gives me an opportunity to refer to a blog that we've just put on the CPRE London website about this very issue under the title Reclaim Our River. written by a campaigning group in Tower Hamlets that's trying to deal with those blockages and open up more of the Thames to public access in Tower Hamlets. But Tom B, I wanted to bring you in here, and there's another question that's linked to this from Andrew Cole, who asks which of the lost rivers would be the most ripe for bringing back to the surface. I don't know whether you can answer that, and what would the advantages be? But feel free to range widely on this question.
Yeah, well, in relation to private and public access, I think walking is a really important way of claiming ownership of places. So the Thames Path, you might assume you could always walk along the Thames, but in fact, that's a really quite recent addition. A lot of the Thames was industrialised until the 70s and 80s, and then redeveloped, and a path was built in where one didn't exist before. So that's a big gain in terms of access to water. But I think if people know about the things that are near them, the rivers in particular, and are interested in accessing them and use them and show that they provide public value, then that is a really powerful weapon against some pretty significant economic forces that want to privatise big chunks of very valuable property. As Lara points out, it's, you know, this is something that really is a big asset in terms of property value in a way that it wasn't a generation ago. So things have really switched, and there are big problems with rivers as a hazard. Obviously, I mean the Wandle was astonishingly polluted until the 80s. You could tell what day of the week it was by the colour of the water, because different factories discharge at different times of the week. And there were a lot of dye factories along the Wandle. There always had been dye mills. So, you know, we've come a long way from that, but with what we have now, other problems have arisen. I'd also like to reference the work of Mark Thomas, the comedian, who's sort of more of a campaigner, really. He did a great bit of work on privatisation and access in London, including holding a village fete on the path outside some flats, which had put up a no loitering sign to try and discourage people. They didn't like people walking past, so he organised a full-scale village fete that lasted for most of the day, which I think is brilliant. But in terms of bringing rivers above ground, I think there are some that are quite clearly below ground. Somebody costed bringing the Tyburn back to the surface through Mayfair as a joke, but it would be an act of revolution, really, because apart from anything else, you'd have to demolish Buckingham Palace to daylight the Tyburn and most of Mayfair. So if that happened, it probably wouldn't be with the agreement of people who own the properties that sit over it. But I do think it's rivers like, for example, the Gravely in South London, which is above ground almost all its way, but is really fundamentally neglected, very degraded environment around it, lots of concrete culverting, but it runs through an extremely densely built up part of town where there's a lack of green space and a lack of wildlife corridors, a lack of ecological opportunities. So I do think that some rivers are absolutely there to be improved, and any improvement will bring not only environmental benefits, but also quality of life benefits for lots of people living nearby. So I don't think we're going to see the Fleet coming back to the surface, because it'd be far too expensive and you'd have to dismantle the sewer system. But there are many other rivers called things like the Ching and the Slade and the Mutton Brook and the Quaggy. The Quaggy's had a lot of effective restoration work. It allows it to spread out, take flood water, prevent water from running off hard surfaces into the drainage system and flooding people's basements and properties. So there's a lot to be gained, I think, and London is a lot more than the places that people visit in the centre. You know, there's a huge amount of outer London with a lot of water flowing through it that needs much more attention.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm pleased you mentioned the Quaggy River in southeast London. This is one of a number of sites that CPRE London is campaigning for the creation of new public parks. The Brent River up in the northwest has a similar local campaign group behind it. The Roding River in East London as well, which has been opened up a bit, which needs to be opened up even more. These are all really kind of, you know, great sites and opportunities to increase the public asset value of London's rivers, actually, and indeed their contribution to tackling climate change, the impacts of climate change, and helping to manage flooding. I wanted to move on to a couple of linked questions in the Q&A panel, which are very topical. I talked about the debates in Parliament over the Environment Bill and amendments in the Lords to tighten responsibilities on water companies to do more to tackle sewage outfalls. So we've got one on that from Mariana Sabiras. Sorry if I mispronounced your surname, Mariana. Who says, I wonder if any of the panelists could comment on the news this week about effluent flowing into various water bodies in the UK. I'm listening in from Canada, so not sure if this has affected London's rivers. Well, it certainly has. But very interested in sewer overflows and so on that many of us are plagued by. And then Katrina Patterson is asking a sort of related question, really. Can we have a campaign to encourage water companies to invest more of their profits in our rivers instead of paying billions to shareholders? Which is, I think, essentially the debate that's been had in parliaments this week. And she asks, should we be return to nationalising I guess she means, rather than rivers, our water companies, to protect water purity and our health. Who wants to dip their toe into this one, so to speak?
Well, I just saw a tweet from George Monbiot just before we started this, calling for exactly that: nationalisation of privatised water companies, reinvestment of the profits that go to dividends to improving our water infrastructure. So I would certainly agree. I'm not sure that it's my agreement that's needed though, but it's really interesting. It's getting so much attention because it's been a problem for ages, and suddenly it's on everyone's radar, which is great. So I think it's part of a long process of persuasion and putting this up the agenda of politicians and making people realise it's a problem that people care about, and that's not been the case until recently. So it's all part of debate that with any luck will lead to this being taken a lot more seriously, because it's a strange thing to be happening in these times, and in some ways there's a lot of investments to deal with it. So the lost rivers flow through storm sewers and still take raw sewage directly into the Thames when the rain is heavy. The Thames Tideway sewer is being built to prevent that. It's the last link in the Victorian sewer system. They never did that. They never put in the final tunnel effectively. So the discharge into the Thames has been happening since then. It's taken this long to solve it. But there are other less hard infrastructure-based ways of solving this sort of problem too, by making sure water doesn't reach the sewer system in the first place. So building big tunnels is probably not really the answer. But the growing awareness is definitely positive.
Thanks, Tom. Tom C., did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have very much more kind of factually to add to what Tom has said about CSOs, combined sewer overflows, other than to show you a picture of one using my amazing high tech here. So this is the chap I referred to previously, Theo Thomas, whom I met on one of the little channels kind of spurring off from the River Lee. And this grill here is the CSO, and you can see all the effluent here just flooding out straight into the Olympic Park. And there's only a couple of minutes before meeting him, I saw these huge, I think they're barbels, fish, meters away from this raw effluent. And you hear all sorts of horror stories. I've not heard this confirmed, but I have heard that whoever's responsible for the waterways in the Olympic Park have actually been putting fish into the river when they've died. Sorry, not when they've died, when other fish, the existing fish have died due to the lack of oxygen in the river. They've merely just kind of restocked it so that the Olympic Park site looks like a kind of pleasant natural environment, which, if that is the case, is pretty shocking to me.
Right, thank you, Tom. Lara, did you have a comment on this question?
Well, yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time on the Thames, and I see in answer to Mariana's question, I see the results of what's going in there. And there's been a sewage spill because it's lying on the foreshore. You're walking on it. Wet wipes are a huge problem. They're actually changing the geography of the river. There's huge islands of them now at Hammersmith. These are coming directly out of the sewage system straight into the river. I live on the Kent coast now, and we're obviously having huge amounts of problems with raw sewage just flowing into the river. My partner is a sea swimmer and hasn't been able to go sea swimming for weeks now. It's disgusting. They're beginning to privatise the railway companies now, aren't they? At least our ones is. I think they should privatise the water companies. It's the only way to safeguard the future of our rivers and our future.
Yeah. Absolutely. So that's useful. We've got a few more questions left in the chat. I'm conscious of time. We've got about just under 15 minutes before we're due to close the session at 8 o'clock. Before coming to the final questions, I just wanted to flag up that CPRE London's running a photo competition during London Rivers Week and up to November the 26th, where we're inviting people to send us their best shots under the heading Picture Blue London, linked to the themes of London Rivers Week. I put a link in the chat for those of you who would like to participate in that. There are prizes to be won. So please look into that and send in your best images to illustrate those three key themes of access to nature, climate change resilience, and health and well-being linked to London's water bodies. I'm looking at a question here from Fiona Howie in the Q&A, talking about erosion of the Thames banks and foreshore, and raising the question of whether or not sea level rise is due to global warming is going to create an increasing problem of that in that direction, and asking also whether or not we can deal with this perhaps by looking at the increase of traffic. I guess Fiona means on the river, which is having a huge impact in terms of increasing erosion. She doesn't want to stop the river being used for industry, but can we control speeds and help reduce erosion in that way? I don't know, Lara, whether you have any reflections on this. Traffic.
Yes, I mean, erosion on the foreshore. One of the reasons mudslarks find so much stuff is because the foreshore is eroding away so quickly, and the speed of erosion has increased enormously since the turn of the century because of the introduction of the clipper service. They have these double-hulled ships. If you're standing on the foreshore when one goes past, you really know it's gone past. It sucks the shingle out and it throws waves back on. And we're losing foreshore. We're losing archaeological, really important archaeological object. There's a medieval jetty at Greenwich, the prehistoric site at Vauxhall that was mentioned by Tom. It's washing away. We're losing foreshore by feet at a time, and I don't know. It's difficult because the river it's coming back. People are using it. It's wonderful to see it being used. It's fantastic to see it so busy, but there is this double-edged sword because the more traffic you have on the river, the faster the erosion, and it is in places when you're down there, you do see it's undercutting the river wall, and there are huge cracks going up some river walls. There's a huge amount of work to be done down there actually now, and they do definitely need to look into speeds and the shape. It's, as I say, it's these double-hulled ships, the clipper service, that are causing the worst problems. I think they do need to look into it because it's a bit of a time bomb at the moment.
Where's the river wall being undercut, Laura?
If you go down to Gabriel's Wharf, you can crawl right underneath the river wall there. There was a huge crack running up the river wall outside the Tower of London. I don't know if that's been fixed. In certain places along the river, you'll see these nets of stones have been dumped. They're there because the erosion is undercutting the river wall. They're trying to save the river wall by doing that. So you know, it is going to come to a point where they're going to need to dump those stones right the way along, certainly central London, just to save the wall from falling in. But the walls are difficult things because some of them are privately owned, some of them are owned by councils. There's loads of different councils. It's really, really complicated once you're down there.
On this question, Claire Harris has just posted a useful link in the chat bar for those that are more interested in the river walls issue, and she's linking us to the Thames Discovery Programme website, which has a post on this question. We're getting.
Can I just?
Yes, Tom. C.
Sorry, Neil. Could I just add a recommendation for anybody who's on Twitter of somebody to follow? I don't know his surname, but he's called Alan, and he's the flood forecaster at the Thames Barrier. And his Twitter handle is Alan Barrier EA, which I assume stands for Environment Agency. Alan Barrier EA. Alan's a great person to follow for if you're interested in that question that our questioner, whose name I've forgotten, I'm sorry, was asking about climate change and kind of rising sea levels. And I think it's really important to distinguish between various different problems. You know, the extraordinary pressing global emergency regarding rising sea levels and other environmental problems from some quite specific things to do with, for example, erosion of the Thames foreshore, and also flooding in London. And it was only a few months ago, wasn't it, when we had those terrible floods in various locations. And, you know, those of us who are in Lost River nerds are always looking for those locations of our lost rivers being the sites of so many of these terrible floods. Some people might remember there was a video on the news a couple of months ago from Pudding Mill Lane, is it? DLR station, Docklands Light Railway Station, and completely flooded, and it was like something out of a kind of apocalypse movie. But of course, the Pudding Mill was a river mill on the Pudding Mill River, which was mostly filled in, partly filled in order to make way for the 2012 Olympics. So of course, if we do block up our rivers, this is going to happen. But that doesn't have anything really specifically, as far as I know, to do with climate change or global warming, so much as to do with, you know, hard surfaces. And also, I just have to very briefly mention the rising water table in London. You know, Lara mentioned much earlier in this presentation to do with industry moving out of London from the 60s. Before that time, London was sucking water out of the water table, so that is the permeable layer of geology beneath our feet, sucking it out for industry, for breweries, for vinegar works, for all sorts of different purposes. And since the 60s, it hasn't been doing that, which means the water table has been returning to its kind of pre-industrial levels. And this is one of the reasons that we're seeing a lot of flooding, particularly along the lines of the Lost Rivers.
Thanks, Tom, for that reminder. We're rapidly coming up to 8 o'clock. We've got a few questions left to answer. And what I'm going to do is perhaps ask each panelist to perhaps sort of deal with these, or as many of these as they can, in their kind of concluding comments. And I'm also going to ask if the panelists could just perhaps give us one suggestion about how you know, we can work more closely together in partnership with other organisations to, you know, promote the benefits and the you know, the cultural significance and value of London's rivers and waterscapes through projects like London Rivers Week, but perhaps new ideas that we might as an organisation, CPRE London, might want to take up. So the three questions that we have left in the Q&A panel are varied. There's a question about, is there native vegetation that we can use to protect riverbanks, particularly the Thames? Wendy Tobbit's reminding me of a fantastic green ground map that somebody called Helen Eilers has prepared, that are available from her website, which use the kind of the London Underground map as a way of connecting green spaces across London. And it also reminds me to mention the work that CPRE London have been doing with the London Friends of Green Spaces network, with our new website called goparks.london, which I do recommend people to look at, that has a wealth of information about London's green spaces and the community groups that underpin so much good work that happens there. And then finally, there's a question actually from Annie Codgel for Lara, and perhaps this is a question that both Toms could also consider responding to as well. And she's asking, what do you feel is the most poignant item you have found, Lara? And maybe we can start with you, Lara, in wrapping up those questions together in your concluding remarks.
Yeah, I mean, the most poignant objects that I find are love tokens. People go to the river to get rid of the things they don't want in their lives anymore. The river's constantly moving, it's taking things away. It has that sense that it's moving. It will take away your problems. I mean, I talk to the river, I've told it more than I've told anybody else I know. And people go to the river to get rid of the stuff they don't want in their lives anymore. You find wedding rings under the bridges and engagement rings, but people have been doing it for generations. You know, I found a 16th century posy ring with "I live in hope" inside. I mean, there's not much more poignant than that. You know, did the hope run out? That's why it ended up in there. You know, bent sixpences. So people have been trying to get rid of pain and regret in the river. And I think for me, those are really the most poignant things that I come across and I find, because they're so personal.
Thank you, Lara. Tom B.
I absolutely can't compete with that, but it reminds me of a story that was told to me by the chief flusher, who's the man responsible for keeping London's sewers clear. He has to do with fatbergs, so his team do, amongst other things. But he said that, I asked him what the weirdest thing was he'd ever found in the storm sewers, and he said that his team found an entire brass bed down there once, which is pretty weird, but it's particularly weird because there aren't any openings that are big enough to get an entire brass bed down. So that means that somebody, for reasons that you could say are poignant, I don't know, certainly bizarre, assembled the brass bed in the sewers and left it there.
Good one. And Tom C.
Yeah, I mean, they're impossible questions to answer. I was just struck by something that Tom B said during his presentation. When you see it, you can't unsee it. But so many of these things are unseeable because they are invisible. And when we're talking certainly about the lost rivers and the lost artifacts to some extent as well. And I just think it's a huge conundrum. You know, how do we get people interested and as interested and as excited by the Thames and by its tributaries as we are? And I think that there's a really pressing concern that I have that that Londoners at large in this great, diverse, young, multicultural city are engaged with this sense of London as a landscape, somewhere they can be proud of and somewhere that they know, and not, you know, we all have the experience of knowing that little area around the tube station that we work by, you know, rethinking London according to its natural landscape, I think just gives us so many exciting opportunities. So I think I don't have any specific suggestions, but it's a conundrum I'm looking forward to thinking about more.
Thanks, Tom. And that gives me the opportunity to remind everyone again of CPRE London's mission, really, to sort of start thinking of London's countryside and promoting the idea both in reality and in the mind. And I think this discussion has illustrated just quite how rich and powerful that kind of reimagining of the city can be. Thank you all to our three excellent panelists for stimulating their excellent presentations and for stimulating such a fantastic discussion. I think for me the thing that links all three is this idea of light and water, and I think each of the speakers has touched on that, with Tom B talking about daylighting, Tom C talking about that wonderful poem Pearl, and Lara's wonderful reading from her book about fog and on the Thames and the impact that has on light. So light and water, let's end on that connected idea. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your questions. And if you want to remind yourself of the discussion and the presentations and the wonderful images that have been shared this evening, a recording of the session will be put up on our website fairly soon. Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you again at some point. Cheers.
Thank you.